it's very difficult to know when sanctions are imposed, what are the trigger points that would actually be considered an act of war.
Welcome back to Breakout with Breaking Views, brought to you by PGIM. I'm Peter Thalassen, the acting global editor of Breaking Views, coming to you this week from the World Economic Forum in Davos. And I'm talking again to Edward Chancellor. This week, we're talking about sanctions, which is one of the hot topics of the conversation in Davos in the past few days. Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, called for maximum sanctions against Russia in a video address the other day. And in private conversations here, there's a lot of talk about whether the United States and Europe would use similar measures against China in the future. But Eddie, you've written a column that casts doubt on the effectiveness of sanctions. Tell us why that is.
Well, I cite in my piece a new book by an American academic called Nicholas Mulder called The Economic Weapon, which is a history of sanctions. And in particular, the focus is on the history of sanctions between the First and Second World War. A bit of history. The sanctions have been around since ancient Greece, but they really only got going in the First World War when the French and British imposed an economic blockade on Germany and its allies. Then after war, and this is quite interesting, is after war, when the League of Nations was created, the people who'd been imposing sanctions during the war said, well, we can use these to keep the peace. And really, we've been with that ever since. And the League of Nations had initially a bit of success again imposing sanctions or threatening sanctions on Greece when it was about to invade a neighbor, and Greece backed off. But the real test came in 1935 when Benito Mussolini's Italy invaded Abyssinia or Ethiopia. And that's when the sort of thrust of my piece says, well, those sanctions failed against Italy. And they failed for a number of reasons. First of all, it's difficult to sanction a large state like Italy. Secondly, the idea of the internationalists who thought up the sanctions, like Woodrow Wilson, the US president, was that sanctions would drive people to behave in an economically rational way. But the truth is that people sometimes, nations, and in particular autocratic leaders, fascist leaders, aren't sort of rational economic actors. They have other things to think about. And the other aspect of the Italian sanctions is that they were incomplete, and the US and Germany were not were not taking part in the sanctions, so that incomplete sanctions are weak. But the most interesting thing, I think, about the sanctions problem with Italy is that they actually brought about a deterioration in the sort of geopolitical situation. Italy was driven into the arms of Hitler's Germany. Germany saw the sanctions, thought that it was going to be sanctioned next, and then went on its escapades into Central Europe, annexing Austria and Czechoslovakia, and then later invading Poland. And we know how that ended up. Now, Japan, at the other side of the world, which was already invaded China, then became desperate about American sanctions on oil and launched its sort of kamikaze attack on the Americans in Pearl Harbor. So you can see that the sanctions triggered a sequence of events that actually brought the Second World War forward rather than brought peace.
Yeah, which brings us back to today, obviously. I mean, clearly the threat of sanctions didn't stop Russia from invading Ukraine. You can argue about whether Vladimir Putin really foresaw the might of the sanctions that would be used against him. But if we sort of run that forward, then, I mean, so what do you think could happen now we're in this situation?
Well, first of all, as I point out in the piece, is if there's any country capable of withstanding very severe sanctions, it's Russia. The Soviet Union was sanctioned at the moment of its creation and blockaded, and it didn't bend. So, I mean, the fact is the Russians know how to run an autarkic empire. That's what the Soviet Union was. And so that's where Putin came from. So that's one problem. The second problem, as we all know, is that the sanctions are imperfect. I point out that for every one country sanctioning Russia, there are 3 countries that are not, including India and China, and those countries account for half of Russian sales, and those sales have have actually increased by 10 percentage points over the last decade. So there are alternative
and
markets.
The oil and the gas, which is still flowing to the West.
And then you've got the fact that the oil, just like the energy wasn't cut off to Italy in 1935, the energy hasn't been cut off to Russia. So in fact, we've seen the Russian trade deficit. I mean, this must have never happened before. The trade deficit actually, the trade surplus actually increasing during a time of sanctions. What I find the most extraordinary thing about the sanctions, the recent sanctions, is that in the past, sanctions had an element of sort of gunboat diplomacy. You went after countries that weren't paying their debts. But this time round, we've really, the most obvious victims of the sanctions, not the war, obviously, which is the Ukrainians, but of the sanctions, most obvious ones, have been the Western investors in holders of Russian bonds and shares. And the fact is that whereas the French sanctioned the Bolsheviks in 1917 in order to get them to stop defaulting, now the Americans are actually propelling a Russian default, and I can't actually see that actually helping the getting Putin to change his mind. And so I think this raises an issue about sanctions that investors have to be aware of. Is that, and this is always the case throughout their history, is they upend private property rights. So that's all very well if you don't own these Russian, but I know a few people who've had quite large Russian positions in their portfolio, and suddenly they got big holes in those portfolios. So I think that's something that investors have to be careful of.
Well, and obviously companies like McDonald's and Renault who basically had to sell out, or in the process of selling out of their Russian businesses at sort of rock bottom prices. But just, I mean, I guess the other question then is, go back to your original analogy with Egypt and Germany and Japan. I mean, I guess the danger presumably is this also sets off a process in other countries of saying, well, this could happen to us too. Let's take steps now to try and make sure that we're not as vulnerable as we are next time.
Yes. I mean, in fact, actually, China, as you probably know, has built up a large, and now probably is subject for a later column, but China is already quasi-autarkic. It's already quite, it has stitched up a lot of raw material supplies, particularly in lithium and other things around the world. And with Russia, so what I'm stressing at the end of the piece is that there's a possibility that Russia is pushed firmly into the China camp, that the assault on Russia, particularly in the global financial system, means a bifurcation of the dollar standard. And in a multipolar world, there is a danger of more stranded assets and more investors finding themselves marked down to zero. As you say, the big risk would be sanctions one day imposed on China. So that is a worrying thought. And the last really worrying thought I take away from this is that sanctions blur the line between peace and war. And as you probably heard, George Soros last week said that in his view, we were already, the Third World War had already commenced. And it's very difficult to know when sanctions are imposed, what are the trigger points that would actually be considered an act of war. So we've been using sanctions a lot recently. There's a great call to use them. Russia obviously needs to be sort of punished and reprimanded, but sanctions are a weapon, an economic weapon that you should handle very carefully.
Yeah. Well, on that cheerful note, thank you, as always, Eddie, and we'll talk again soon.
Buy gold.